And we are live. Welcome to another episode of the Not Another Yoga Class podcast and LinkedIn Live series. Today, I have a very special guest. I've got Julie White, who is a neurodiversity and resilience coach, and also the founder of Bright White Life. This is quite a personal subject today. I've recently been diagnosed with ADHD, and I've found it very, very challenging to articulate what that means and what I struggle with. And because this is part of Julie's job, it's what she does every day, and she also has ADHD, I thought it was a great opportunity to kind of bring some awareness to what ADHD means for people that don't necessarily have ADHD in the workplace, but are working with people that might. So welcome, Julie.
Thank you. Great to be here, Jamie. Thank you.
So I guess to start with, from a very, very broad definition, what is ADHD?
Okay. Well, ADHD, the acronym, stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. I personally have lots of issues with that definition, but it's what we have. It's what it currently is defined as. It's had various different terms over the years. But I think the first thing is to say it's not attention deficit. It's more about a inability to control our attention. So that can mean that we struggle to keep attention to something, and we're flitting off in different directions, and we're jumping from one task to another, and we find focus a real challenge. On the flip side, we can hyper-focus on something, and we can find ourselves completely absorbed in a task for several hours to the extent that we ignore everything else. And that could be everything from eating, drinking, communicating with others. We just go into the zone and we're in that space, and nothing else matters. And we can lose hours and suddenly go, goodness me, where did the last 3 hours go, for example? But equally, we can say, goes the other way, where we can flip between things and go, I've got nothing done in the last 3 hours because I've just jumped from one thing to another. And that can be really exhausting as well. The hyperactivity side as well is also often misunderstood. So it's often, I'm going to go down the stereotype, but it's often that naughty boy in school who is jumping around all over the place, doesn't sit still. I kind of was that as a kid. My teacher described me, my report when I was 7 said, if only Julie could curb her tongue and wandering feet, she shows great promise. To my teacher, this was the 80s and ADHD was not really understood at all. But I was that fidgeter chatterbox. But as I've got older, it has probably gone more internalized. So that hyperactivity is less obvious on the outside, depending upon the environment I'm in. I tend to mask that hyperactivity. But it's internal thoughts, constant brain constantly on the go. So that's where hyperactivity can be not so externally obvious, but it might be in the form of fidgeting as well. So
I think that's where most people struggle with the understanding it, right? It's where my memories of the kids who had diagnosed ADHD when they were really, really young was that they were just bouncing off the walls. And because that wasn't me, for my entire life up until this point, I just assumed that I couldn't have it. But when you're talking about that hyperactivity inside the brain, this is something that I can totally relate to.
Yeah. And like I say, I was late diagnosed myself 2.5, nearly 3 years ago now. And I hadn't really put the two together and related that. And when I chatted to my brother, who was kind of the best person to ask about my childhood, he said, oh, you were like the Duracell bunny. You literally were non-stop. And I think back now, and yes, I was either at gymnastics or I was at Brownie Guides or I was at drama class. I was constantly on the go with some sort of activities alongside the school day and sports and everything. So I was a bit of that, but that was controlled, and I was fortunate that I had all those activities to do that kept me busy. I don't know what things would have been like if I wasn't kept busy in a positive way. That I think can be the challenge. And it often shows up in those who are disruptive to others, really. And that's where I'm going to say that's stereotype of that naughty boy syndrome, because it's also much more identified in boys are kind of expected and allowed to be boisterous and so on, whereas girls are expected to be quiet and demure and sit still and do as you're told, and that's kind of trained into us socially as well. So there's a social aspect that I think impacts on why particularly women are not diagnosed as children and are finding they're seeking a diagnosis often when they become parents themselves and have sort of diagnosis for their children, that they're realizing that they're not coping because there's also those factors going on. So yeah, it's definitely becoming more prevalent for adults to seek diagnosis. Yeah.
How does it manifest in the worst way as an adult? What ways does it kind of impact us that are negative?
I think one thing we chatted before hitting the call, we were chatting about burnout and how we can find ourselves taking on too much, saying yes to too many things because in the moment we want to do it, and then it sort of escalates and can become sort of out of control, that we've got too many demands on our plate and we're not really able to manage them all. So that can often be how it manifests ultimately, from a point of view of us prioritizing other things over ourselves. Often we tend to put our own needs at the bottom of the pile, and maybe I'm speaking that more from a female perspective, but I certainly know that's how it's manifested for me. Is I prioritize everything else, and the last thing I've got time to squeeze into my schedule is me, because I will meet everyone else's, the outer demands and everyone else's demands ahead of mine. Yeah, that's how it shows up for me.
What about the best way? Because obviously we talk a lot about the negatives when it comes to neurodiversity, but there is a little bit of a superpower in there as well, isn't there?
There is to some extent, and I mean, I'll be honest with you, I'm not a huge fan of this terminology of a superpower, just because I think it does lack appreciation of the impact of the challenges and for all the positives that we can find. I think it's important to get that balance. It's what we would describe neurodiversity, and as a neurodiversity coach, we talk about a spiky profile. So our highs are high, our strengths are high, but our challenges are low. And it's getting that balance between the two. For me, I can come up with lots of ideas. I can be very creative, very enthusiastic about things, which brings a huge, positive energy to a situation and can help lift people, for example. But if I don't have the support around me, those lows can be really low, where I'm really struggling with the simplest, what seems like the simplest of things. And that's often where it can play out as well, is that you're seen to be, you can do that brilliantly, so why on earth can't you do that? And it's like, I don't know, I can't explain to you why I can sit there at a pile of washing and for 5 days ignore it, because I just can't. And it's not a difficult task, but there's something that my brain goes, I can't do that. And it's almost like the most boring task, there needs to be something more boring that comes along for me to actually do the boring task.
100%. This I identified. This is why I never do my taxes, because it's always there as the worst thing I could possibly do, so that I'll always end up doing the other stuff. But I think this is probably what made me identify it first, was this inability to do boring stuff. For example, a perfect example is this morning, I ordered a pair of sunglasses online, but just hammered my way through the checkout process because I didn't want to check anything or read anything. Not only are they being sent to the wrong county, I didn't apply the discount in the way I should, so I didn't get a discount for it. I also used the wrong card because I was just banging my way through the process. And then there was a contract that needed signing as part of a kind of family financial thing. I got the contract signed wrong because I didn't read it. It's always the same story. It's a boring thing. I don't have the mental capacity for something so simple. And yet I can sit there for, like you say, 4 to 6 hours and write a complex business plan or a course or whatever it is, no issue, because I find it interesting.
Yeah, it's one of the key things, particularly with ADHD, is that we need it to be what's the acronym of NICE, which is, it needs to be novelty. It needs to be of interest to us. There needs to be some level of challenge, and there needs to be urgency, or more importantly, emergency. Like, this has to be done now. Sometimes that urgency is fine, but actually, that's next week. I've got time for that. I can do that next week, and then next week comes around, and suddenly it's like it's right front and center, and it has to be done. And the challenge with that is that you end up doing it last minute. And then for me, I certainly always feel like, what if I'd had more time, I could have done a better job with that. And actually, there's this kind of principle, Parkinson's law, of where the work will expand to fill the time. If the time is only an hour, we'll get that done in an hour. You'd be amazed how much you can get done in an hour if that's all you've got, right? And sometimes you can achieve so much more. And other people go, how on earth have you managed to smash that piece of work out in an hour? Well, because that's all the time I had. So that's what I've done. That's what you've got. Don't give me a deadline that's 10 months away. I'm not going to start it until the week before, right? I was the same with, as you mentioned, tax. So my tax return, last week of January, I did it. Right? I actually purposely set aside January to go, I'm not taking on any more commitments to work in January, because there's got to be the headspace to do that, because it wasn't something that could be done in an hour, because I still had all the bookkeeping to do actually before I could do the tax return, because all of that's boring, right? And then my coaching qualifications, assignments, I went down to the wire with about 2 weeks to go until my assignments deadline was, and that was only by having other people really support me and encourage me and putting accountability sessions in and all sorts of strategies I knew I needed to apply to make sure that got done, because it became urgent, but it was always important and it was of interest to me. But just sometimes I need help to get started with things. So it can be as simple as that, going, I just need a 15-minute chat to get my brain in that frame of mind for that topic, and then I can fly with it. But leave me to do it for myself, I will sit there and procrastinate and go, that's too difficult. So, but once it gets started, it's not half as hard as it felt when I was just looking at a blank piece of paper, for example. So, yeah.
We've touched on a few things that I guess managers or colleagues could do to make things easier. Is there anything that you want to add to that? One thing that I can think of is no long meetings.
Oh, yeah, no long meetings, no meetings for meeting's sake. Ask yourself with any meeting, and I think this applies across the board, ask yourself with any meeting is, does this need to be a meeting? Could it be an email? Could it be a briefing document? Because sometimes that's what it could be, and that would be easier for everybody. Also, does everybody who you've asked to be at this meeting need to be at this meeting? And then challenge yourself. What is the purpose? What is the key thing we want to achieve from this? Focus on that. Make it really, really clear from the outset. That's anything more than an hour, I would say, for is pushing it. But also provide information beforehand so people can get thinking ahead, because sometimes the answer we give in the moment isn't our full and complete answer either, because we're thinking on our feet and we're thinking with the first thing that comes to mind. And it does help for us to have time ahead of time to think about it. And that will depend on different people's neurodivergence. Some people will really need to know, what's the agenda? What are you going to ask me about? Because otherwise I'm not going to give my best contribution in this meeting. If I don't know, I'm actually going to sit back and be quiet. And that might be, again, that might be the person in the room who identifies as autistic, who needs to do thinking first before they give a measured answer. And actually then it's the person with ADHD who talks and talks and talks out loud, thinks out loud. So what they start off as their idea does not go around, it goes around the houses and it's a totally different answer at the end of it as well. But they monopolize the meeting and not everybody gets a contribution, right? So it's getting that balance about meetings as well for contribution from everybody.
Brilliant. And just so we can kind of finish this off, what is it that you do specifically and how do you help?
Okay, so I do a variety of things, particularly around neurodiversity. So I can do talks that will raise awareness. I happily share my own experiences of living with ADHD undiagnosed in the workplace, and then also the strategies that have helped me. And some of those really quick, easy wins that don't cost anything. That example we talked about around meetings, there's no cost involved in that. It's just about thinking differently and preparing and planning for that meeting to get best from it. A lot of adjustments don't cost anything. And then taking a person-centered approach, which is where one-to-one coaching can come in really, really helpful for individuals to explore different strategies that are going to work for them. And particularly with ADHD, to recognize that strategies might work for a time, but then it's no longer novel or interesting. So that strategy stops working. And we often don't realize that's why, especially if we're not diagnosed. We go, why can I just not do this thing that 3 months ago I was following that perfectly well? Now I just can't do it because we're not interested. It's not novel anymore. So being able to adapt and flex and try different things and recognize that coaching can really help explore that for an individual as to what's going to work for them. So that's the other key thing that I provide.
Amazing. And where can people find you if they'd like to?
They'll mostly find me hanging out on LinkedIn. So I'm Julie White. If you look me up on there, if you look at my business page, Bright White Life Coaching and Training, you'll find me there as well. That's probably the best place to look for me. You can find my website as well, brightwhitelife.co.uk.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for coming on, Julie.
You're welcome, Jamie. Great to talk to you. Thank you.